50,000 people, including 150,000 civilians. 33. 34. It was faced with the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands in an operation codenamed Operation Downfall. Based on the U.S. casualties from the preceding island-hopping campaigns, American commanders estimated that between 50,000 and 500,000 U.S. troops would die and at least 600,000, 1 million others would be injured while invading the Japanese home islands. The U.S. manufacture of 500,000 Purple Hearts from the anticipated high level of casualties during the U.S. invasion of Japan gave a demonstration of how deadly and costly it would be. President Harry S. Truman realized he could not afford such a horrendous casualty rate, especially since over 400,000 American combatants had already died fighting in both the European and the Pacific theaters of the war. 35. On the 26th of July, 1945, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of China issued a Potsdam Declaration that called for the unconditional surrender of Japan. It stated that if Japan did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. 36. 37. The Japanese government ignored this ultimatum, sending a message that they were not going to surrender. In response to the rejection, President Truman authorized the dropping of the atomic bombs. At the time of its use, there were only 2 atomic bombs available, and despite the fact that more were in production back in mainland US, the third bomb wouldn't be available for combat until September. 38. 39. A photograph of Sumitomo Taniguchi's back injuries taken in January 1946 by a U.S. Marine photographer on the 6th of August, 1945. The uranium-type nuclear weapon codenamed Little Boy was detonated over the Japanese city of Hiroshima with an energy of about 15 kilotons of TNT, 63,000 gigajoules, destroying nearly 50,000 buildings, including the headquarters of 2nd General Army and 5th Division, and killing approximately 70,000 people, including 20,000 Japanese combatants and 20,000 Korean slave laborers. 40. 41. 3 days later, on August the 9th, a plutonium-type nuclear weapon codenamed Fat Man was used against the Japanese city of Nagasaki, with the explosion equivalent to about 20 kilotons of TNT, 84,000 gigajoules, destroying 60% of the city and killing approximately 35,000 people, including 23,200 28,200 Japanese munitions workers, 2,000 Korean slave laborers, and 150 Japanese combatants. 42. The industrial damage in Nagasaki was high, partly owing to the inadvertent targeting of the industrial zone, leaving 68–80% half the non-dock industrial production destroyed. 43. 6 days after the detonation over Nagasaki, Japan announced its surrender to the Allied powers on August 15, 1945, signing the Instrument of Surrender on the 2nd of September, 1945, officially ending the Pacific War and therefore World War II, as Germany had already signed its Instrument of Surrender on May 8, 1945, ending the war in Europe. The 2 atomic bombings led, in part, to post-war Japan's adopting of the Threenon nuclear principles, which forbade the nation from developing nuclear armaments. 44. Immediately after the Japan bombings. After the successful Trinity nuclear test the 16th of July, 1945, which was the very first nuclear detonation, the Manhattan Project lead manager J. Robert Oppenheimer recalled, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, and most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multimed form and says, 'Now, I am become death. the destroyer of worlds. I suppose you all thought that one way or another. J. Robert Oppenheimer, The Decision to Drop the Bomb, 45. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Immediately after the atomic bombings of Japan, the status of atomic weapons in international and military relations was unclear. Presumably, the United States hoped atomic weapons could offset Soviet Union's larger conventional ground forces in Eastern Europe, and possibly be used to pressure Soviet leader Joseph Stalin into making concessions. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union pursued its own atomic capabilities through a combination of scientific research and espionage directed against the American program. The Soviets believed that the Americans, with their limited nuclear arsenal, were unlikely to engage in any new world wars, while the Americans were not confident they could prevent a Soviet takeover of Europe, despite their atomic advantage. Within the United States, the authority to produce and develop nuclear weapons was removed from military control and put instead under the civilian control of the United States Atomic Energy Commission. This decision reflected an understanding that nuclear weapons had unique risks and benefits that were separated from other military technology known at the time. Compare B-36 bomber. For several years after World War II, the United States developed and maintained a strategic force based on the Convair B-36 bomber that would be able to attack any potential enemy from bomber bases in the United States. It deployed atomic bombs around the world for potential use in conflicts. Over a period of a few years, many in the American defense community became increasingly convinced of the invincibility of the United States to a nuclear attack. Indeed, it became generally believed that the threat of nuclear war would deter any strike against the United States. Many proposals were suggested to put all American nuclear weapons under international control by the newly formed United Nations, for example, as an effort to deter both their usage and an arms race. However, no terms could be arrived at that would be agreed upon by both the United States and the Soviet Union. American and Soviet /Russian nuclear stockpiles. On the 29th of August, 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan. See also Soviet atomic bomb project. Scientists in the United States from the Manhattan Project had warned that, in time, the Soviet Union would certainly develop nuclear capabilities of its own. Nevertheless, the effect upon military thinking and planning in the United States was dramatic, primarily because American military strategists had not anticipated the Soviets would catch up so soon. However, at this time, they had not discovered that the Soviets had conducted significant nuclear espionage of the project from spies at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the most significant of which was done by the theoretical physicist Klaus Fuchs. The first Soviet bomb was more or less a deliberate copy of the Fat Man plutonium device. In the same year, the first US-Soviet nuclear war plan was penned in the US with Operation Dropshot. With the monopoly over nuclear technology broken, worldwide nuclear proliferation accelerated. The United Kingdom tested its first independent atomic bomb in 1952, followed by France developing its first atomic bomb in 1960 and then China developing its first atomic bomb in 1964. While much smaller than the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union, Western Europe's nuclear reserves were nevertheless a significant factor in strategic planning during the Cold War. A top-secret white paper compiled by the Royal Air Force and produced for the British government in 1959, estimated that British B-bombers carrying nuclear weapons were capable of destroying key cities and military targets in the Soviet Union, with an estimated 16 million deaths in the Soviet Union, half of whom were estimated to be killed on impact and the rest fatally injured, before bomber aircraft from the U.S. Strategic Air Command reached their targets. 1950s. Although the Soviet Union had nuclear weapon capabilities at the beginning of the Cold War, the United States still had an advantage in terms of bombers and weapons. In any exchange of hostilities, the United States would have been capable of bombing the Soviet Union, whereas the Soviet Union would have more difficulty carrying out the reverse mission. The widespread introduction of jet-powered interceptor aircraft upset this imbalance somewhat by reducing the effectiveness of the American bomber fleet. In 1949, Curtis LeMay was placed in command of the Strategic Air Command and instituted a program to update the bomber fleet to one that was all-jet. During the early 1950s, the B-47 Stratojet and B-52 Stratofortress were introduced, providing the ability to bomb the Soviet Union more easily. Before the development of a capable strategic missile force in the Soviet Union, much of the warfighting doctrine held by Western nations revolved around using a large number of smaller nuclear weapons in a tactical role. It is debatable whether such use could be considered limited, however, because it was believed that the United States would use its own strategic weapons, mainly bombers at the time, should the Soviet Union deploy any kind of nuclear weapon against civilian targets. Douglas MacArthur, an American general, was fired by President Harry Truman, partially because he persistently requested permission to use his own discretion in deciding whether to utilize atomic weapons in the People's Republic of China. In 1951, during the Korean War. 46, Mao Zedong, China's communist leader, gave the impression that he would welcome a nuclear war with the capitalists because it will annihilate what he viewed as their imperialist system. 47, 48. Let us imagine how many people would die if war breaks out. There are 2.7 billion people in the world, and a third could be lost. If it is a little higher, it could be half. I say that if the worst came to the worst and one half dies, there will still be one half left, but imperialism would be razed to the ground and the whole world would become socialist. After a few years there would be 2.7 billion people again. Mao Zedong, 1957-49. The concept of a fortress North America emerged during the Second World War and persisted into the Cold War to refer to the option of defending Canada and the United States against their enemies if the rest of the world were lost to them. This option was rejected with the formation of NATO and the decision to permanently station troops in Europe. In the summer of 1951, Project Vista started, in which project analysts such as Robert F. Christie looked at how to defend Western Europe from a Soviet invasion. The emerging development of tactical nuclear weapons was looked upon as a means to give Western forces a qualitative advantage over the Soviet numerical supremacy in conventional weapons. 50. The US and USSR conducted hundreds of nuclear tests, including Desert Rock exercises at the Nevada Test Site, USA, pictured above, during the Korean War to familiarize their soldiers with conducting operations and countermeasures around nuclear detonations, as the Korean War threatened to expand. Several scares about the increasing ability of the Soviet Union's strategic bomber forces surfaced during the 1950s. The defensive response by the United States was to deploy a fairly strong layered fence consisting of interceptor aircraft and anti-aircraft missiles like the Nike, and guns, like the M51 Skysweeper, near larger cities. However, this was a small response compared to the construction of a huge fleet of nuclear bombers. The principal nuclear strategy was to massively penetrate the Soviet Union. Because such a large area could not be defended against this overwhelming attack in any credible way, the Soviet Union would lose any exchange. This logic became ingrained in American nuclear doctrine and persisted for much of the duration of the Cold War. As long as their strategic American nuclear forces could overwhelm their Soviet counterparts, a Soviet preemptive strike could be averted. Moreover, the Soviet Union could not afford to build any reasonable counterforce, as the economic output of the United States was far larger than that of the Soviets, and they would have been able to achieve nuclear parity. Soviet nuclear doctrine, however, did not match American nuclear doctrine. 51. 52. Soviet military planners assumed they could win a nuclear war. 51. 53. 54. Therefore, they effected a large-scale nuclear exchange, followed by a conventional war which itself would involve a heavy use of tactical nuclear weapons. American doctrine rather assumed that Soviet doctrine